is reported by the narrator, and as a consequence, direct discourse covers only a part of the plot, and at times a very small part of the plot. And this, of course, makes the transformation of plot into network a lot less accurate. But having said one should not do it, of course, I will do it, and I will show a few networks from Our Mutual Friend and The Story of the Stone. A couple of years ago, I conjectured that the number of characters could be a major source of morphological difference between Chinese and Western novels, and networks seemed like a good idea a good way to test the idea. Unlike what I've shown you here, however, I cannot present networks for the entire text. I could probably manage Our Mutual Friend, which by Western standards has a lot of characters, but still, I could probably manage to put them all on a slide. Certainly not the hundreds and hundreds of characters of The Story of the Stone, by one Chinese count, 985. So I will limit myself to showing some chapter networks drawn from the first 20 chapters of each book. And even at that scale, the difference is very visible, because in The Story of the Stone, chapters have between 5 and I will only chart direct discourse, explicit verbal interactions between characters. Story of the Stone chapters have between 5 and 28 speaking characters, with an average of almost 15 per chapter. A Mutual Friend is a lot lower, between 3 and 14 speaking characters, with an average below 7. And here is a typical Dickens chapter, the first of the second book, and which introduces Jenny Wren and Headstone. The following, it's a variation on this really, two characters are the same, and Rayburn is the other suitor of Lizzie's after Headstone, and then there is another family member, Jenny's father, or the fourth chapter of the second book. This is Mr. and Mrs. Lamwell's revenge against Podsnap via his daughter, and so on and so on. Now, in Western novelistic poetics, aside from a very few neoclassical exceptions, symmetry has never been a significant category. But then you look at these networks. These are a few chapters from the book. And, I mean, it's stunning how symmetrical the arrangement tends to be. Probably there are two reasons for this. The first is that the building blocks of Dickens' chapters are themselves symmetrical. These are usually pairs, like husband and wife, parent and child, beloved and beloved, rival and rival, colleague and colleague, etc., etc. And then second, these building blocks can project their symmetry onto the chapter as a whole, because there is very little noise around them, very few other characters that can disrupt the symmetry. So in other words, with few characters, symmetry seems to emerge, or at least seems to emerge in this case, almost by itself, even without a culture of symmetry, which certainly did not exist. It didn't make any sense around Dickens' novels. A culture of symmetry, on the other hand, exists and is very powerful around Chinese novels, with their aesthetic expectation, as Andrew Plax puts it, that an overall sequence of chapters will add up to round and symmetrical number, pronounced sense of symmetry, exercises in structural patterning. Most noticeable among them is the practice of contriving two great hemispheric structural movements. Hemispheric movements exist also at the scale of the chapter here. In fact, they are announced at the beginning of each chapter in The Story of the Stone by couplets that function as epigraphs. Jurui's wife delivers palace flowers and finds Jia Lian pursuing night sports by day. Jia Baoyu visits the Ningguo mansion and has an agreeable colloquy with Qin Shi's brother. Character A does this and meets character B. C does that and meets D. A very earnest young woman offers advice by night, and a very endearing one is a source of fragrance by day. So perfect symmetry. Parallel prose, as Chinese aesthetics calls it. So you take the chapter networks from The Story of the Stone, and the black edges will indicate connections in the first half of the chapter, red ones in the second half. I actually simplify. I didn't exaggerate here the sort of asymmetries. And I thought that this, especially this is one of my favorite, is fascinating because I had assumed that Chinese novels would have far more symmetry than European ones. No, and the key probably is again the number of characters. Just as with few of them, symmetry emerged almost by itself, with many characters it becomes simply too unlikely, and at least at the scale of the chapter. But then, okay, so what do these asymmetrical structures do? What do they mean? Dickens symmetries are, have a very clear potential meaning. They're sort of a melodramatic substratum of love or hatred, which is always ready to erupt and emerge. Asymmetry? Let's look at one network in detail. This chapter 7 of the novel, and Juru, his wife, up there, is a member of the staff of this mansion where the novel takes place, and she must report to Lady Wang, who's somewhere on the right, about the visit of a distant relative. She doesn't find her in her apartment, so she asks about her, is sent to other parts of the compound, is given errands, she asks about new faces she hasn't seen before, old people she doesn't see anymore, is asked to intercede for her son-in-law, and in doing all of these things, she ends up meeting a dozen, actually speaking with a dozen characters. She meets just about twice as many, and again, another 20 are mentioned in the various conversations. Now, nothing major happens here in this chapter, right? I mean, people talk, they walk around, they play Go, they gossip. No single interaction is in itself significant. Taken together, they are because they embody a sort of reconnaissance of relationships. And this happens very often in this novel, making sure that the nodes in that region of the network are communicating smoothly. It's one of the most distinctive concepts, keywords of Chinese cultures, guangxi, something like connections, translate Gold, Guthrie, and Wang, part of a specifically Chinese idiom of social networks linked to other building blocks of sociality, such as sentiment, human feelings, faith, and reciprocity. All in all, a world which is neither individual nor society-based, but relation-based. And one must work for these relations. They're not a given, these relations. They are an artifact. Manufacturing obligation, chain of transactions, indebtedness, consciously producing connections. This is a lexicon of guanxi. So a chain of transactions that aim at generating indebtedness. This is another chapter in the novel. And Jia Yun, who is here in the chapter, he's a poor relative of the Jia family, and he's looking for work. He goes there, he asks Jia Lian, he receives only very vague promises. So then he goes to Bu Shiren, who is an uncle of his who owns a store. He hopes to get some perfumes on credit by him to use as presents. Bu Shiren says no, but then he invites him to dinner, but then his wife makes a scene, cancels the invitations. Jia Yun walks away, and then he bumps into a drunk, which is that Ni Er, who turns out to be a neighbor of his, who turns out to be a racketeer, who has money and gives him money to buy these perfumes finally, which he offers to Xi Feng, who is one of the most incredible characters in all of world fiction, is a young, sarcastic woman who is in charge of the finances of the whole clan. This is how guanxi works. Manufacturing obligation.